In part one of this series, we discussed the beginnings of Devernon Legrand, from his birth in North Carolina to his start in a life of crime on the streets of New York City. Legrand first came under the watch of law enforcement in the late 1940s, while chauffeuring for a woman by the name of Mother Robinson. Mother Robinson was at the helm of a Brooklyn church, which was the home of a scam involving women who dressed as nuns in order to solicit donations from the public. When Mother Robinson passed on in 1949, Devernon Legrand would continue the scheme. We last left off in the early 1960s. Devernon Legrand has now fashioned himself into a bishop, with a doctorate degree in philosophy of theology. His claims of being a faith healer, and his growing influence over his cult following, was slowly permeating the streets of New York City, specifically Crown Heights, Brooklyn, where he had established the St. John's Pentecostal Church of Our Lord in 1958. The brownstone headquarters at 222 Brooklyn Avenue housed numerous women and 20 children, 19 of whom were believed to be fathered by Devernon himself. He also accumulated 5 other properties, which would house those connected to his church. After a 1961 court case involving 2 of his nuns assaulting a policewoman, prosecutors felt that Bishop Devernon Legrand's schemes were coming to an end. In the coming years, their assumptions would be proven futile. Devernon would spend 90 days in jail following the assault of a female neighbor in 1963. After that, he went back to his old ways. His church family would continue to grow, as would his reputation and wealth. This is Devernon Legrand, the Bishop of Crown Heights, the bizarre and murderous case of America's forgotten cult leader. Part 2. A family grows in Brooklyn. Wednesday, September 1st, 1965. Devernon Legrand, the Bishop of Crown Heights, is back in the news and sitting in a Brooklyn jail. After a court appearance, he would be held on $75,000 bail, which would soon be lowered to $25,000. But why such high bail? And what exactly was Devernon and the St. John's Pentecostal Church of Our Lord up to now? It would turn out that Devernon Legrand was in custody for charges including kidnapping, assault, weapons, and drug possession. 27-year-old Bernice Williams, who I discussed in part 1 of the story, would be the one responsible for bringing the kidnapping charges against Devernon. She once served a 6-month sentence for assaulting a policewoman while posing as a nun on the streets of New York City. According to Bernice, she was first kidnapped from her neighborhood of Bayside, Queens in the early 1960s. She would tell police that recently she tried to escape, but was tracked down by Devernon at a local post office. From there, she said she was in prison for 7 days without food, in retribution for her escape. 28-year-old Ernestine Timmons would bring assault charges against Devernon and would show up to the precinct with a black eye. 26-year-old Betty Jane Davis would bring the other assault charge, stating that she had been threatened with a revolver by Legrand because she was not obeying him. Ernestine Timmons and Betty Jane Davis were also reported to be pregnant at that time. When police arrived at 222 Brooklyn Avenue with a warrant in order to search the premises and apprehend Devernon, they would find marijuana, 2 unlicensed pistols, knives, which I assume weren't the type he used in the kitchen, and numerous pornographic material. Devernon Legrand's 16-year-old son, Clavell Legrand, would also be taken into custody and charged with attempting to stab a police officer with a dagger. Detectives at that time were fielding numerous complaints in reference to Legrand's St. John's Church. But outside the kidnappings and assaults, one complaint would rise above them all. Word from inside the church was that if any of the nuns went against Legrand, they would be threatened with death and immediate burial by Devernon. Devernon reportedly told some of the women that they would end up buried just like the others. Police would start digging up the backyard at 222 Brooklyn Avenue, searching for 3 nuns who had vanished from the premises. They would not find any human remains, and couldn't positively confirm that Devernon had anything to do with the disappearance of the women. In part 1 of this story, I spoke about an affidavit produced by the state in 1961, which discussed the numerous children and women found inside 222 Brooklyn Avenue. The state at that time claiming that 19 of a reported 20 children inside were fathered by Legrand. However, law enforcement couldn't possibly fathom the new changes that occurred in just 4 years' time when they raided the premises in September of 1965. From September 15th to September 17th of 1965, journalist Razik Estatis will put out a three-part story on Devernon Legrand and the St. John's Pentecostal Church of Our Lord for the Philadelphia Daily News. The exposé, which was titled "The Bishop in the Harem," would paint a bizarre picture of the church and let the country know what was happening on a small street in Brooklyn, New York City. Detectives would arrive at St. John's Pentecostal Church of Our Lord at around 8:30 a.m. and enter with a warrant. Detective Michael Lizio would state, "The first thing I saw was bare women, running all over the place." He would count 11 women in total, with 7 of them being pregnant. Detectives would also count a total of 47 children, all of whom they felt resembled Devernon Legrand. That would be 27 more than previously reported back in 1961. There were numerous rooms set up, which were said to be the size of closets, and all of them had padlocks on them. Other rooms were equipped with shelves, made with 2x4 slabs of wood, which is where the children seemingly slept. Future Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Elliot Golden, who was working as Chief Assistant District Attorney at that time, stated that he believed they were just scratching the surface on Devernon Legrand. According to Golden, he would be investigating claims including kidnap, rape, adultery, and impairing the morals of minors. There was also word of one of Devernon Legrand's 16-year-old sons being wed in an arranged marriage. Devernon Legrand's real estate holdings and his car collection would also have to be investigated. He had been seen driving 2 different Cadillacs, a Chevy Impala, and a Pontiac. A few years prior, investigators stated that the church had as many as 5 residents in their organization, 2 being right around the corner from 222 Brooklyn Avenue, at 1002 Sterling Place and 1007 Sterling Place. Despite all the incomprehensible things detectives witnessed during the raid at Devernon Legrand's church, Devernon would only be liable for an assault charge. There seemed to be nothing authorities can do about the numerous pregnant women and dozens of children scattered around the church home. At this time, Devernon had over 10 arrests since arriving in New York City from North Carolina, and this latest incident was just another notch in his belt. Devernon Legrand had been perfecting his hustle for almost 20 years. At just 41 years old, he had hypnotized dozens of women and children, and any complaints brought against him would prove to be impulsive actions by his loyal followers. Perhaps they didn't fully think through what they were doing. After all, they had all bought into the church's constitution, a constitution which said they shall do nothing but serve Devernon Legrand and his family, till the day they perished. Once again, Devernon Legrand got off easy, but the following year, he would almost pay the ultimate price. Thursday, December 8th, 1966. It's 1:30 a.m., and Devernon Legrand, along with his teen sons Nathan and Clavel, are outside their residence at 222 Brooklyn Avenue. A Cadillac pulls up in front. The man inside produces a rifle and points it at the trio. The trio begins to run down Brooklyn Avenue. Shots ring out. Devernon Legrand is hit in the back and falls to the ground. The man speeds off. At 5 a.m., police arrive to the basement apartment at 960 Sterling Place. They would arrest 37-year-old William Tucker, who was a superintendent at the building and living in the basement. Hours earlier, someone threw a rock through his basement window, shattering it. According to Tucker, he shot Devernon Legrand in a case of mistaken identity. He would tell authorities that he was looking for somebody named Georgie. He would be arrested and held on $2,000 bail. Meanwhile, Devernon Legrand was at St. John's Hospital recovering from his injury. Now let's look at some of the dynamics of this incident. William Tucker's window was smashed out hours before the shooting occurred at 1:30 a.m. Sometime in the early morning hours of December 8th, he started cruising around looking for his target. When he spotted Devernon Legrand in front of the St. John's Church at 222 Brooklyn Avenue, he decided that he found his target. It's also important to take notice of William Tucker's address, 960 Sterling Place. This address is just right around the corner from 222 Brooklyn Avenue, and on the same block as 2 other properties Devernon owned at 1002 and 1007 Sterling Place. In my opinion, it would be impossible for Tucker not to know who Devernon Legrand was. He was the sharp-dressed bishop of Crown Heights, who had a home filled with a reputed 50 residents and an impressive car collection. 3 of his residents were just a stone's throw from Tucker's apartment. Furthermore, Devernon's reputation had already permeated the streets of Crown Heights, and he was no stranger to the local authorities and various news outlets. So I ask, was it a mistake? Perhaps only William Tucker and Devernon Legrand knew the truth. Devernon Legrand would heal up and go about business as usual, continuing to lure women into his church under the guise of religious freedom and servitude to the Lord. In actuality, Devernon was the Lord, and his nuns served only to expand his kingdom. In time, we would learn once more that Devernon Legrand's cunning advances were not all he had in his recruitment efforts. Saturday, October 5th, 1968. Devernon Legrand is back in a jail cell and being held on $25,000 bail in connection to kidnapping and rape charges. This time, the charges were brought against Devernon by 23-year-old Kathleen Kennedy, a British-born blonde who was living in Brooklyn and working as a clerk at Chase Manhattan Bank. According to Kathleen, she attended a party at the Brooklyn Avenue Church, and within days, Devernon, accompanied by two men, appeared at her apartment at 894 Eastern Parkway and abducted her. She would then be held captive at 222 Brooklyn Avenue and repeatedly raped and beaten. Kennedy would further state that she was also transported upstate New York to the hamlet of White Sulphur Springs, which is in the town of Liberty, Sullivan County. It would be revealed that Devernon accumulated 58 acres of land in Sulphur Springs, which he called Legrand Acres. The land, which included a large home, promoted horseback riding, swimming, camping, and fishing. Kathleen Kennedy's whole ordeal would last 7 months before she managed to reach the local authorities. Police would once more raid the residence at 222 Brooklyn Avenue and find numerous women and children, as well as two .22 caliber revolvers, a .32 caliber automatic, and a .45 automatic. Along with the arrest of Devernon were the arrest of 26-year-old Sister Betty McKay and 31-year-old Ernestine Timmons, who after filing assault charges against Devernon in 1965, went right back to his family. According to authorities, Ernestine Timmons had also taken part in the kidnapping and beating of Kathleen Kennedy. Police would also raid his White Sulphur Springs estate and arrest 4 more of Devernon's flock on weapons charges. Was Devernon's twisted existence finally catching up to him? A conviction of this magnitude would certainly land him in the slammer for many years. He was in deep shit. However, in a strange turn of events, 23-year-old Kathleen Kennedy, the British-born blonde who laid claims of kidnap and rape, dropped all charges against Legrand. Even more peculiar, in February of 1969, she would marry Devernon Legrand and become a sister at the St. John's Pentecostal Church of Our Lord. He was free again, with a young wife ready to breathe new life into his holy revival. By March of 1969, another woman was coming forward with charges of kidnapping. At the time, the woman stated that she was with Legrand for 19 years, and she was recruited into his holy scheme at 14 years old. Police didn't disclose the name of the woman at that time, in order to protect her identity. In the end, it all didn't matter, because after forging the complaints against Legrand, all charges would be dropped, and the woman returned right back to his grips, her life resuming as one of his sisters. The 60s were coming to an end, a decade that proved rather successful for Devernon Legrand and his tabernacle. He skated free on numerous charges, and his power only grew with every charge he escaped. He was a wealthy man, with now a reported 50-plus children to over 10 women, numerous New York City properties, and a sprawling upstate New York resort. But in time, Devernon Legrand would once more almost meet his maker. Sunday, March 16th, 1970. 46-year-old Devernon Legrand and his cohort, 44-year-old James Ward, arrived at 656 McDonough Avenue in Brooklyn, New York City, at around 8:15 p.m. It's the home of Ernest Timmons, father of Ernestine Timmons, a woman who carried 6 of Legrand's children, and who was arrested in 1968 in connection to the kidnap and assault of 23-year-old Kathleen Kennedy. She had since left the church and sought refuge at her father's home. Devernon and Ward would show up to the home armed with pistols and demand that Ernestine come back to the church. Ernest Timmons would get into an argument with the duo and assure them that his daughter Ernestine was not leaving his premises. After noticing that Devernon Legrand and James Ward were armed, Mr. Timmons would produce a pistol of his own.
Legrand and Ward raced back to their vehicle and speed off into the night. James Ward was hit once in the chest and once in the abdomen. Devernon suffered a gunshot to the chest as well. They would race to Kings County Hospital, but by the time of their arrival, James Ward had already succumbed to his injuries, keeling over inside the luxury vehicle. Legrand would be admitted to the hospital in critical condition. Ultimately, he would survive his injuries. Ernest Timmons would be booked on manslaughter and assault charges. The following day, he would be arraigned and find that not only was local police detective Albert Nelson coming to his aid, but Assistant District Attorney Theodore Gerald was also on his side. Assistant DA Gerald would tell Judge Robert Kreinler, "These two men went there to kill Mr. Ward, and Devernon Legrand is an unsavory character in the first degree." The idea that a detective and a local prosecutor would show up in support of a man who was booked on killing someone and shooting another said a lot. These men were just two of a long list of lawmen who were trying to berid the streets of Devernon Legrand for many years. Legrand would eventually make his way out of the hospital. He had escaped death once more. The 1970s started out with a bang. Devernon Legrand didn't know it yet, but he was looking ahead at his last few years running the streets of Crown Heights, Brooklyn. This is Devernon Legrand, the Bishop of Crown Heights, the bizarre and murderous case of America's forgotten cult leader. Part 2. A family grows in Brooklyn.